Juneteenth is our newest federal holiday. And I think it's an important thing to process, what does that mean? Why do we have it? Because whenever a holiday goes from something someone celebrated, and obviously Juneteenth's been celebrated for more than 100 years, to being recognized by us, our nation, as something so special as to be set aside. It means we as a community, like a greater national community, said there's something that this brings to the conversation of who we are that is so important, we need to stop at least once a year and talk about it. I think the best way to get into answering the question, why Juneteenth, is to start with a story from my childhood. So as you all know, I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. Now, San Antonio, Texas is a really interesting place. It is very much a military bastion. When I was growing up, we had 4 major Air Force bases, Joint Command at Fort Sam Houston, and Camp Bullis, which has both Texas National and Texas Air National Guard. What that means is, well, San Antonio is the 8th largest city in the United States, and more than that now, or at least that's what it was when I was a kid. It operated a lot like a small town, but was deeply patriotic, but not in the way that civilians mean patriotic, the way the military means patriotic. What do I mean? If you went to San Antonio for 4th of July, you'd be underwhelmed by the fireworks. If you went to San Antonio on Memorial Day, you'd be underwhelmed by the barbecues. Even though it is Texas barbecue, and of course, therefore the best. But here's the thing. What you would find is something you don't find outside of like small towns. You'd find places where veterans would gather, soldiers would talk, speeches would be given, bands would play, parades would occur, and you would learn about the day, whether or not you're celebrating our freedom, remembering those who have died, or honoring the veterans who have served. There would be gatherings. People would get together from all backgrounds across the city in hundreds of places. One time, my dad took me to one of those. There's a place at Fort Sam Houston called the Quadrangle, which is the old base going back to pre-Civil War time, that they've turned into this beautiful park. And I'm there, and it is something like you would see out of a small town, which is you have the stage with a group of veterans in their uniforms behind, a band behind them of the volunteers of whoever brought their tuba that day. You have a few local politicians, I mean local, like House Representative from District 82, local. Okay, there to give speeches about July 4th. My dad took me, and frankly, I was going because I knew that if I went to all the speeches and I sat quietly through as a teenager, afterwards there was an air show. And I could turn to my dad and say, hey, since we're already here, can we go to the air show and I can crawl around like tanks and airplanes? So we're sitting there, and we do the whole thing. It's what you'd imagine it would be, right out of like a Hollywood film. And the state rep gets up, and I don't even remember if it was a him, her, it doesn't matter. The state rep gets up and starts talking. And I notice that my dad is uncomfortable, which is weird because all the guy was talking about is how great America was. I mean, it's 4th of July after all, it's what you talk about. My dad's 18 years into his 20 years in the military at that point. He's trying to figure out, is it going to be 20 or 26? Those of you who've lived through that internal debate, that is a hard conversation internally to have, right? And he's uncomfortable. So we go through the rest of the day as I expected. We're driving home. It's about a 45-minute drive. And I turn to my dad, and I'm like, hey, Dad, what made you uncomfortable? And my dad was never a political guy. Like, he said he voted sometime back in the 60s. And then when I was like in college, I finally got him to vote again in 2000. Okay? So he's never been a political guy, so I thought it was odd. So I turned to him like, hey, Dad, why did that bother you? And he thought really hard for a minute. I could tell he didn't know if he wanted to even talk to me about this. He looked at me and said, here's the problem. That guy's not a patriot. He's a nationalist. And that's different. So being a good teenager, I said, well, I got to ask questions now. He's uncomfortable. Nothing is better as a teenager than an uncomfortable parent, right? So I got to follow up. I'm like, well, what do you mean? And he said, you know, I used to work in military intelligence. I said, yeah. He said, here's the thing. The military for a long time, he's like, I read this study once in which the military was trying to figure out if someone was captured by the enemy, whoever that might be, who is the type of person who's going to hand over the state secrets first and who's going to hand it over last, which is like an obvious thing that the army would want to know, right? Okay. And they said going into the study, everyone had the same assumption that like the uber patriotic, like tattoo of the American flag, every fire on firework on 4th of July, that dude, we all know that dude, right? Like Sergeant Slaughter from G.I. Joe. Okay. That dude would be the last to break, right? I said, well, that makes sense to me. He said, that dude was the first to break. I said, why? He said, here's the thing. A nationalist loves their country because they believe their country to be perfect, because they can only see what is good. A patriot loves their country in spite of the bad they already know, because they love the good that much. And I must have given him a look like I was completely confused with what the heck he was getting at. So he looked at me and said, listen, if you ever get married, what is better? Marry a woman who thinks you're perfect, or marry a woman who knows the whole you, the good and the bad, and loves you anyways? Because if you marry someone who believes you're perfect, you're setting yourself up for a divorce, because someday they're going to wake up and realize you. That's the difference between a nationalist and a patriot. That is the conversation that Juneteenth has with 4th of July. See, a nationalist or a patriot is perfectly fine with 4th of July because there are many good things about our country. There are many good things about the United States. There are many things that are noble. There are many things that are great. There was a moment in which the American flag flies over the majority of the population of the world just at the end of World War II. Think about it. Flew over France, flew over Britain, flew over all the parts of Europe that was conquered by the Nazis that wasn't conquered by the Soviets. Flew over all the parts of Imperial Japan that had fallen. Had we been nothing more than empire, had we been no better than the Soviet Union, those countries wouldn't exist today. But for the most part, we left. And I say the most part because there's a whole bunch of Micronesian countries that have a lot of issues with us that are valid concerns. The nationalist can see the beauty in that we went and we left. They can't acknowledge the places we didn't. The patriot can acknowledge both and say, we are better than others. We are not empire the way the Soviet Union was or the way North Korea is. We have things that are noble. See, on one end of the spectrum is the nationalist who can only see what is good and deny what is bad. On the other end of the spectrum is the mudraker. The mudraker is the person who can only see what is bad. Those of you who fought in Vietnam and came home and got spat on met mudrakers. Those of you who came home from Vietnam and people said, I just want to let you know, no thank you, met mudrakers. They exist. They're not as prevalent as they once were. I've only met a few in my life, but these are people who only see what is wrong and cannot see what is noble, cannot see what is good, cannot delineate the difference between what it means to be an American and what it means to live under the Taliban, which is crazy. And just as blind as the nationalists, just in the opposite way. That's why Juneteenth is so important. Because, well, the mudraker cannot live with July 4th, cannot live with the reality that, we do things right from time to time. We do a lot of things good. There is a lot of noble points in American history. The nationalists can't live with that there are moments which are blotches on our soul. The patriot, however, sees us for who we are, sees our nation as both saint and sinner, sees inside and knows the good that we have done, the noble moments in our history that do matter. but also knows the story of Wounded Knee and the moments in which we fell short of the ideals we proclaim. Neither the nationalist nor the mudraker can ever move forward. For the mudraker, all is lost and nothing is able to be had. For the nationalist, all is perfect and there is nothing more to accomplish. For the true patriot, they realize what is good, realize what is not, and say, let's be better. Juneteenth reminds us of what it means to be better. Because there was a time in which slavery was in this nation. And Juneteenth marked the beginning of the end of slavery in this nation. We became better than we were. We are not perfect. We are far from it. But it is not a condemnation or a damnation that the mudrakers may say, but merely a call to action, a call for each generation to make us better. Those of you who have military background, or those of you who just like watching NCIS a lot, you will know that there is a statement, right? You are called as a person, if you serve in foreign services or military, to fight enemies both foreign and domestic, right? You are to go and fight at Omaha Beach just as quickly as the fields of Gettysburg, right? And yet Juneteenth reminds us there is a third enemy. There is the enemy that threatens us from without, the enemy that threatens us from within, and the enemy that lives inside of each and every one of us. The enemies of prejudice and racism. The enemies that tell us that we are not equal, that call us inside ourselves to not fulfill what our founding fathers said, but also to not fulfill what God said. See, the reason we as Christians care about this, the reason Juneteenth is important to us, is that we read the Bible, and the Bible tells us you are not slave nor free, nor black nor white, nor Jew nor Greek. You are children of God. And if we truly live that, truly believe that, then we have to purge ourselves of racism and prejudice. See, we are called not just to defend the country from enemies domestic and abroad, but also within. What does that mean? That means the person who died on Omaha Beach, the person who died on the battlefields of Gettysburg, the people who died marching in Birmingham are all saints of our country, are all people defending us, sometimes from ourselves. So as you go out today, on this Juneteenth holiday, on this Juneteenth weekend, take time and ask yourself, how are you doing with your calling as a citizen, as a Christian, at fighting the enemies abroad, the enemies domestic, but most of all, the enemy within? Amen.